So, let's get started. Hi, I'm Wouter. You pronounce it like router with a W. It's that seems to be the only way to do that in if you're a native English speaker. And I'm going to be talking about testing. Who here actually is a tester? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, that's quite nice. Who isn't a tester? That's probably the rest then. Yeah. Don't worry. I think you're all wrong, so it's okay. I'm going to talk about testing. The role of the tester is one way to look at it, and what a tester should do more, or can specialize in more in a team that's doing continuous delivery. But also the other way around, what the rest of the team should be doing about testing. And I got to this particular subject because actually a good friend of mine was Cyrilo Wortel. He was giving a talk in the Agile testing days, and he was talking about the history of the tester and how the role of the tester had changed through Agile. And he ended his talk with a picture of a dodo. Not this particular picture, because he actually drew it himself, very artistic. But you can imagine that a conference full of testers, anyway, that can generate a little discussion. And I think that most of that discussion simply comes from the fact that very few people have actually been working in teams that are doing real continuous delivery. So it was all very scary. I am not going to talk too much about the history. I'm going to focus on what's relevant in a modern team, and have a little look into the future, but not too far, because that doesn't work. But let me very quickly go through things like, waterfall. Another thing that I noticed is that fewer and fewer people have actually worked in a waterfall project. That's good. We're getting somewhere. So this doesn't mean all that much, but for the people who have, they know that it looks more like this. And the role of the tester there is one that's always under pressure and isn't really very interesting, because it was mostly just manual execution of test scripts. So not very interesting. We're not going to spend too much time on it. Red also took a really long time, so that little box at the end was really much at the end, and the tester got involved very much at the end. Of course, everything changed when we started doing Agile, which is good, because at least the testing had to be done in like the 2-week sprint that was there. And the tester was much more involved. Of course, also there, in reality, it kind of got squeezed at the end, especially if you were working in an Agile team that was still doing manual testing, or, God forbid, was doing full through the UI Selenium end-to-end testing, which then took a day to run. So that was only run at the end of the sprint because of time constraints. So there were still plenty of things, but in a well-working Agile team, the testing was actually spread out over pretty much all of the process, working with the requirements, working on getting acceptance tests, and still doing exploratory testing, but it was all done in a nice flow. Of course, a team like this is a team that's doing test-first development. And Jez Humble at the start of the conference asked for a raise of hands about this. I'm going to do the same thing. Who is doing test first? Okay. Yeah. So that's really disappointing. Who's doing acceptance test first? So there's still 5, 6 people. Good. So to make it a little easier, if a developer in the team that you're in pushes his code to source control, who feels comfortable letting that code go to production. That's a little more. That's good. That's good. So, about a month ago, I gave this same speech at a testing conference, and the percentage of testers and non-testers, or at least as they proclaim themselves, was reversed, and there were two people who put their hand up at the end there, which either means that the testers are less trusting, or that you guys have a better setup. But it is kind of worrying, of course, that the whole test first thing is still at such a low adoption rate. I had kind of expected that at this particular conference it would be higher, but apparently we heard this morning 25% is the level at what we can get. Which is odd because it was one of the things that came out of the first XP project. So it was part of the Agile system from the start. Now, if you're working in a test-first Agile team, and I'm going to take that as a baseline, so some of you have some work to do still. So if you're working in a test-first team, you're doing a number of practices, and those are still there if you are going to do continuous delivery. And I need to find my slide. Okay, so you're going to be working with a tester and a developer and the business on the requirements. You're going to be putting those things in probably in executable acceptance scenarios, which is happening over here. And also you're going to be exploratory testing still. And usually you will have some sort of test environment where you're doing this. So for a talk where I'm going to be saying how things change when you're doing continuous delivery, I'm going to take that as a baseline. All of those things you're still going to be doing in pretty much the same way when you're doing continuous delivery, but you're going to doing them in a shorter cycle. And you're still going to work on those requirements. You're still going to write that acceptance scenario. You're still going to automate that. The first thing that is different there, and that's one of the reasons why I like the whole concept of continuous delivery so much, is that there is no longer a separate step here for the final manual test that always seems to still be there, even in pretty good Agile teams. There is no longer a safety net for the team, but for the developers, that they can rely on to make sure that the changes they're doing are okay. That means that the checks that you're making all along this process need to be much more reliable and need to feel reliable for the whole team. It also means that the whole exploratory testing thing is fine, but you do that on production. And since I've been doing this talk at a testing conference, this is the point where the torches and pitchforks usually come out. I've had that particular discussion in a lot of teams that I've been working with. Oddly enough, it's definitely not just the testers that get very, very nervous if you say that. It's even more so for the developers. That I wasn't kidding about the feeling of the safety net. So, if no one's going to lynch me, I'm going to continue. But there will be time after both of our talks to grill us about these kind of issues. So as I was saying, in continuous delivery, the basics are still there. We can see we are doing 3 Amigo style BDD, or acceptance test driven development. Even though in this room, probably 10% of you is doing it, it is one of the core practices that you need to master if you want to get control of your system. I'm sorry about the voice. I'm still very, still more bothered by my cold than I thought. You are going to be working test first, because if you are a developer and your code is going to be in production multiple times a day, there is no room to delay that particular test. You are also going to do proper automation of those acceptance tests. That means that you will be doing automation of your acceptance scenarios, but you're not going to run those through the whole system. You're going to be targeted in that, so that they can be fast and that they can be stable. And there's loads of other types of tests that you actually need to do to make sure that your system is actually performing as you want. It's not just unit tests, it's not just acceptance tests. There's integration tests, there's contract tests, there's component level tests. There is actual end-to-end tests because you still need them. So all of those things are still necessary. You're probably going to be using things like feature toggles to make sure that you can test things in production that your end customers are not already using. And oddly enough, this morning at one of the at Dave's talk, this was apparently a trigger for loads of questions, but you're probably going to be pair programming. No one has time for a pull request process. So that means that for testing purposes, there's been work done on the requirement side. There's been work being done on implementing the acceptance test. The tester will be pairing with the developer on that acceptance tests, on generating more scenarios, more examples for that test. And I've, in my teams, often also, when a developer is writing not TDD unit tests, but the larger type of flow unit tests that you also have, oftentimes the tester just is called in. I'm going through these cases, can you see any more? And all the while, this testing on production is still going on. The thing that's really different from a good working Agile team is mostly that this whole process is going much faster. Releasing a couple of scenarios to production during a day is normal. But of course, that's not the interesting part. All of this we know at least that we should be doing. Maybe you're not doing them yet. I actually think that going and switching to actually pushing to production for many of the teams has been the thing that made them start actually taking those practices seriously. It's so much easier to delay a test, or maybe just write a test but not go through the whole process of actually identifying all the tests that you should have been writing for your code, if there is that safety net. So again, not much different, but much more focused and much more important. But earlier I kind of lied, because there's, it's not just the tester that actually cares about the system in production. There is another person that has always been very much focused on keeping the system running in production. And that's the guy who gets called at 3 a.m. When it goes down. That's the operations engineer. He's probably not really the guy who, it's not another safety net, but he's probably the guy that cleans up if you didn't put the safety net in. But oddly enough, the operations engineer, for a very interesting part of his job, is doing one thing a lot. He's writing monitoring checks, which are nothing but tests. Of course, there are tests being run continuously. And one thing that I've noticed in the teams that actually start doing DevOps, which means they have the tester and the developer and the operations engineer in the same team, that as soon as these people start actually taking an interest in each other's work, interesting things happen. For instance, on one team, the tester started getting much more involved in the monitoring side of things, and we already had lots of tests that actually at a business level checked whether the system was doing what it was supposed to do. But including those kind of tests in the monitoring system meant that the operations engineer, when something did go wrong, could much easier identify what the problems, what the importance of the problems was. Also, because we also had lots of integration tests, and we did that in the right way with adapters between systems and tests both ways. By including a subset of those that were possible into the monitoring system, it became much easier to identify where the issue was if one occurred. And basically, what you're doing here is you are getting the knowledge from testing and from development and from ops, get them together, and actually, in a very fairly cheap way, by simply making them talk and work together, much improving the stability of the system. So that's one part of the operations story. Of course, there's another part, deployment. So what happens during a deployment pipeline? A couple of things. We compile, we test, and then we deploy, and then we check whether the deployment was successful. And again, this process has lots of overlap between operations and testing, which also means that this is another area where testers can add a lot to the process, or where learning about testing can help you a lot in getting this process up and running. So that is the whole of it. But then there's another step, because all of these things are still fairly technical. And as we were saying before, testers are also usually involved a lot in the requirements process. But actually bringing testing expertise into the requirements and prioritization process is where you start actually making use of the capability to do continuous delivery. So who here is familiar with the term MVP? So keep your hands up if in your company it's ever been used as anything other than first milestone. Oh, that's still quite a lot. That's nice. So an MVP is nothing but a test. It is a hypothesis of what we think will happen on the business side if we implement a certain feature. And again, this is an area where you need different types of expertise. You need to know about the business, but you also need to know how to set up an experiment, how to set up a test. And that is another area where testing expertise is very much necessary. If you, some people have taken to call that hypothesis-driven development. This is an example from one of my projects. But if you start your not your user story as much, but usually at a little higher level, if you start looking into a feature, then you should be able to set up a test and to set up the system so that you can get an answer to the question on whether we should actually be delivering this particular feature. And oddly enough, just going through the process of formulating that particular test is enough to make you realize that you shouldn't. So it's a very good way of making sure that you don't do work that you shouldn't be doing. But it requires a testing mindset in that you actually see this as an experiment. And that is something that needs to be taught to mostly our product people, because it can be very confrontational if all your product ideas for the of all your product ideas for the next quarter, only 3 out of 6 actually are seen to be delivering any value. So making sure that everything you do is set up as a test, as an experiment, can really help you get much more value out of your development team. All of that is only possible if you can deliver quickly, if you can use things like feature toggles, if you can do things like A/B testing, which are part of the technological underpinnings of doing continuous delivery. Now, so basically what I'm saying is that if you don't include testing and experimentation in all the areas of development and in every role, then you're probably going to be missing out on lots of lots of possibilities for stability and for control, and actually for value. For me, this has always been a core part of software development. And as I said, it kind of started already with the test first approach from XP, all the way to doing the same thing with customer tests, whether they be local or somewhat more externally focused. And we should probably have a name for that, something like test-driven development or something like that. But anyway, that skill set remains very much important, even if it's going to be spread out over many more people in a development organization, which got me to at least acknowledging that for the testing mindset, the future is still pretty bright. So that was my my part in this, and I think that I'm going to have to hand it over to Dave.